Every time you entertain certain emotions without bringing them into submission to Christ, you're unknowingly signing spiritual contracts that give demonic forces legal access to your mind, your circumstances, and your destiny in ways you never intended but now can't seem to break free from no matter how much you pray. I discovered this truth the hard way when I realized that my recurring struggles with anxiety weren't just chemical imbalances or stress responses. They were the result of spiritual agreements I had made through prolonged emotional states that created legal entry points for tormenting spirits that 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5 says must be brought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. What you're about to learn will completely transform how you handle your emotions because you'll finally understand that feelings aren't neutral. They're either gateways to God's peace or portals for demonic oppression, depending on whether you steward them biblically or allow them to run unchecked through your soul while creating contracts you don't even know you're signing. Subscribe to Faith Ablaze Network and hit that bell immediately because I'm about to expose 5 emotional states that become spiritual contracts when you dwell in them, and understanding this will give you the keys to breaking agreements you didn't know existed while protecting yourself from making new ones that could derail everything God has prepared for your future. The first hidden spiritual contract is chronic worry that Philippians 4 verses 6 to 7 explicitly forbids when it commands us to be anxious for nothing, and every time you rehearse worst-case scenarios, obsess over problems you can't control, or meditate on fears about the future, you're actually inviting the spirit of fear that 2 Timothy 1 verse 7 says God did not give you, which means if he didn't give it, someone else did, and you open the door through emotional agreement with lies about God's inability to handle your situation. Worry isn't just a bad habit. It's a spiritual contract that says, I don't trust God's faithfulness. And that agreement gives anxiety permission to torment you legally because you've essentially chosen fear over faith through the emotional state you've been nurturing. You know you've signed this contract when worry has become your default response to uncertainty, when you can't sleep because your mind won't stop catastrophizing, and when every good thing that happens is immediately followed by anxiety about when it's going to fall apart, because prolonged worry creates neural pathways in your brain and spiritual pathways in your soul that demons use as authorized highways to bring exactly what you've been fearing into manifestation through self-fulfilling prophecy that looks like circumstance but is actually the fruit of the contract you signed with your emotions. The second devastating spiritual contract is harbored bitterness that Hebrews 12 verse 15 warns can defile many people. And when you refuse to release offenses, replay past hurts, or nurse resentment against people who wounded you, you're signing a contract that gives the spirit of bitterness legal right to poison every current relationship, including ones with people who had nothing to do with your original wound. Bitterness doesn't stay contained to the person who hurt you. It spreads like cancer through your entire emotional system until you become toxic to be around, suspicious of everyone's motives, and incapable of receiving genuine love because the contract you signed through prolonged resentment has given demonic forces permission to distort your perception of reality and make you see betrayal where there is none. Ephesians 4 verses 26 to 27 warns not to let the sun go down on your anger because it gives the devil a foothold, and that foothold is the legal access created by the emotional contract of bitterness that transforms you from victim of one person's sin into prisoner of your own refusal to forgive, which means the person you won't release is actually holding you captive through the contract your bitterness signed without your conscious awareness. The third hidden contract that destroys destinies is sustained jealousy and envy that James 3 verse 16 says brings disorder and every evil practice. And when you consistently compare your life to others, resent their success, or secretly wish for their downfall, you're signing a spiritual agreement that blocks your own blessings because you've essentially declared through your emotions that God is unfair, untrustworthy, and incapable of blessing you without taking from someone else. Jealousy creates a contract that says, I don't believe God has enough for everyone. And that agreement gives the spirit of competition, strife, and poverty legal access to your life because you've rejected the abundance mindset that Ephesians 3 verse 20 says God operates in when he does exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think. You've signed this contract if you struggle to genuinely celebrate others' victories, if you secretly feel relief when people you envy experience setbacks, And if you've noticed that the harder you fight for success, the more it seems to elude you, because jealousy creates spiritual barriers that repel the very blessings you're desperately pursuing, while you watch those same blessings flow easily to people who've learned to celebrate what God does for others without comparing it to their own timeline or measuring whether it's fair. The fourth spiritual contract most Christians don't recognize is prolonged grief that refuses to accept God's sovereignty. And while grief itself is natural and biblical, there's a difference between healthy mourning that processes loss and toxic grief that becomes an identity you refuse to release because staying broken gives you an excuse for why you're not pursuing purpose or fulfilling calling. Job 1 verse 21 declares that the Lord gives and takes away, and blessed be the name of the Lord. But when you hold on to grief so tightly that you make it your identity, you're signing a contract with the spirit of death and sorrow that Proverbs 18 verse 14 says crushes the spirit and prevents you from experiencing the joy and life that John 10 verse 10 says Jesus came to give abundantly. This doesn't mean you shouldn't grieve losses. It means there's a season for mourning according to Ecclesiastes 3 verse 4, but that season should lead to healing rather than becoming a permanent residence where you camp out while using your pain as justification for why you can't move forward into everything God still has planned for your future despite what you've lost in your past. The fifth and most dangerous emotional contract is sustained lust that 1 John 2 verse 16 identifies as the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life that are not of the Father but of the world. And every time you entertain sexual fantasy, consume pornographic content, or meditate on impure thoughts instead of taking them captive to Christ's obedience, you're signing contracts that create soul ties with spirits that 1 Corinthians 6 verse 16 says make you one with whatever you've joined yourself to spiritually, even if there's been no physical contact. Lust creates contracts faster than almost any other emotion because sexual sin is uniquely powerful in establishing spiritual bonds that 1 Corinthians 6 verse 18 says are sins against your own body, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and these contracts give demonic forces legal access to your thought life, your dreams, and your sexual desires until what started as curiosity becomes compulsion you can't break through willpower alone because you're fighting spiritual agreements that require spiritual warfare to cancel rather than just behavioral modification to manage. Breaking these hidden spiritual contracts requires more than just stopping the emotions. It requires recognizing them as agreements, repenting specifically for making them, renouncing the legal access you gave through prolonged emotional states, and replacing toxic emotions with biblical alternatives that Galatians 5 verses 22 to 23 identifies as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, which are fruits of the Spirit that create contracts with heaven instead of hell. If this message exposed emotional contracts you didn't know you were signing, subscribe to Faith Ablaze Network and hit that bell for biblical strategies that break spiritual bondage. Comment what country you're watching from and share this with someone whose emotions have been creating contracts that are blocking their breakthrough. They need to know that what they thought was just feelings is actually spiritual warfare requiring divine intervention to cancel agreements that have been operating legally in their life through emotional states they never recognized as dangerous.